What should Congress do about the nation's housing crisis? Hi, I'm Chris Castile in the Washington Bureau of the Oklahoman, and I'm here with Oklahoma Congressman Frank Lucas, who is a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee, which has been dealing with this issue of how to protect homeowners maybe facing foreclosure. Congressman, is there a need for federal intervention in this problem?
Chris, that's one of those debates that's been long and loud in the Financial Services Committee and on the floor of the House. And in all fairness, it's kind of a regional answer. If you look at the places like California, Nevada, Florida, the Northeast, Indiana, certain places in Illinois, clearly there is a huge financial problem. There are a substantial increase in foreclosures. There's property that can't be sold that's sitting on the market. But if you look at the rest of the country, for instance like Oklahoma, where housing foreclosures actually in the fourth quarter of 2007 went down, not up. If you see places like Oklahoma where our price levels, at least through the first quarter of this year, continue to increase, then you have to wonder, how do we come up with something that fairly addresses those parts of the country where they're hurting, without disadvantaging those of us in places like Oklahoma? Because after all, the most recent statistics I've seen, 92% of the mortgage holders in this country are paying on time without a problem. There's 6% who, for whatever reason, may be behind or late on a payment or two, but it's only about 2% that are actually in default, headed towards foreclosure, headed towards one of these actions. So how do we make sure that you help people who may need to be helped without putting excessive fees and burdens and responsibilities on both people paying their mortgages on time and companies who've legitimately written those contracts and issued those mortgages to homeowners? Because homeownership's an incredible success story here in the United States.
Sure. Your committee, the House Financial Services Committee, has a bill. The Senate Banking Committee is working on a bill. The administration has its own ideas about what to do. What are the prospects of a major housing bill this Congress?
I would tell you that I think it's the next round of statistics. If the foreclosure rates in those states I mentioned earlier, in the Southwest, in Florida, in the Northeast, in certain parts of the Midwest get worse, then there's a high probability. Clearly the administration would like to have something that they can sign, because where people are hurting, they're hurting badly. I agree. Now, in all fairness to Chairman Frank, my Financial Services Committee chairman from Massachusetts, Barney has a more aggressive attitude about government involvement. We are now on approximately bill number 3 in his efforts to do that. His latest package evolves around an effort to have the FHA, the federal entity that handles mortgages, basically guarantee $300 billion in mortgages out there. And he's added on a concept, and the Senate, as we speak, is finalizing their version of a bill, where basically if you were in foreclosure or were deemed by your lender, if it became law to not be able to pay your bill, you'd be able to go to your lender, and the lender could turn to FHA, and if the lender would reduce your mortgage to 85% of the current value, that's not what you paid for the property a year or 2 or 3 ago, 85% of the present value, then they would guarantee the loan. They would have to, I believe, give you a 10% equity in whatever this new valuation was. Basically, a pretty amazing handout a pretty amazing second opportunity if perhaps you bought something that was bigger than you could afford, or something that were on terms that might have been unbelievable. See, that's the bottom line, Chris. All of these so-called subprime mortgages were what I would define as non-traditional 10, 20, 30-year fixed-rate mortgages. They were mortgages that allowed people to either pay no principal or very little. Sometimes you put off any principal payment on the note, on the mortgage, for 5 years or longer down the road. You had balloon payments. You had all sorts of wondrously flexible terms which enabled people perhaps who bought homes who couldn't have afforded them otherwise, or bought homes that were substantially more than they could have afforded. You know, it goes back to sort of the adage that our mothers taught all of us when we were kids. If it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true. And now it's come home to roost. This is a tough one for me, because my constituents are saying to me in my town meetings, hey Frank, I make my payment. I only bought what I could afford. I saved and I scrimped and I came up with my down payment. How dare you tell me that you're going to subsidize somebody's house on the beach in Florida, or somebody's house in New York, or property in Nevada where they shouldn't have ever built in the first place? And that's kind of a hard argument to disagree with.
There's concern about the kind of people you described making their neighbor's house payment who didn't make as good a choices. There's also concern about bailing out speculators
Oh, yes.
or unscrupulous lenders in this. And how do you guard against doing that? I mean, what kind of safeguards?
And that's the problem. That's the problem, Chris. You and I are both aware of, in published accounts of, and I observed it myself, this custom called house flipping that occurred here in D.C. With prices going up at 15-20% a year for the last 2 or 3 years of the so-called boom that became a bubble and now a bust. You had congressional staffers, people who don't make a lot of money, who are buying these properties under these subprime terms, holding on to them for a year, taking their 20% profit, buying substantially bigger property or buying more properties as an example. And when the house of cards collapsed, when the air went out of the balloon, they've all gotten caught. And there's some more of that up and down the East Coast too, and the West Coast also.
Florida
how do
too,
you
probably.
exactly? How do you help good, honest folks who are just trying to make a living and make their payment without benefiting, one, financial institutions that should not have been generating these kind of deals, and number two, consumers, be they unofficial speculators or whatever, who knew it was too good to be true. How do you do that? And that's the problem. That's why Barney's on the third draft of his bill. The Senate bill tones down some of Chairman Frank's proposals. The message, the feel I get from the White House is they believe something needs to be done in the areas where this is a problem, but they don't like Barney's language. $300 billion in new loan guarantees, that's a substantial exposure for the U.S. Treasury. But I will also tell you, Chris, my home builders, the people in Oklahoma who are involved in building homes and selling these properties, tell me that there is a psychological effect, that because of the stories on the East and West Coast, people have become very timid at home. There's a hesitation. Our economy, the unemployment rate went down to 2.9% last month. We're rocking and rolling, but there's a fear based on what people are seeing in the national media, and that's causing a slowdown of buying and new construction in Oklahoma. I have to think that there's got to be a way to address these problems that takes some of that unrealistic fear, which is inappropriate in Oklahoma, off so we can get back on track. But that final formula is not there yet, Chris.
Right. Well, it'll be interesting to watch it develop, Congressman. Thanks so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. And look for more on this and other stories in the Oklahoman.